Hello, everyone. So today's lecture is focusing on rape culture and public health. And what we're going to be doing is looking at rape culture from a multitude of perspectives, but then focusing particularly on a public health approach to sexual assault. Before we get into any sort of topic like this, I think it's really important to recognize obviously the sensitivity of this topic, and to also recognize that the community that we create in this class are communities of people who know survivors, who are survivors, and so forth. So I put into the module links to several services on campus, and it's just more for your reference if you need them and whatever. And while this topic is very difficult to listen to in many ways, and I'm very sensitive to that, it's important to talk about because it exists. It is a very big issue within our society. It impacts our society on many ways and the health and well being of many people. And avoiding it because it is sensitive and could be triggering does not actually alleviate the problem, but makes it worse. Again, so the focus today is particularly on sexual assault and rape. Of course, though, when we talk about sexual assault and rape, we should really sort of think of it as a continuum of violence against women because, of course, they are not, oftentimes, sexual assault, rape, and so forth are not isolated incidences but are connected to larger systemic violences against women. And just to put this into perspective, because I think it's really important to talk about violence against women broadly speaking, because it's all interconnected, I wanted to share a couple alarming statistics, and many of you might have been shared these before, so it could be repeated knowledge, but I think it's important because it really sort of sets the context of what we're talking about. So, the global estimates by the World Health Organization indicate that about 1 in 3, around 35% of women worldwide, have experienced either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. This number is probably higher, but because of underreporting, this is what we have right now. An average of 1 in 4 women are survivors of sexual and physical violence in the United States. This number is probably higher, but again, because of difficulties in reporting and people not being able to report or feeling afraid to report, this is the average that we have. An average of 3 women every day are murdered. Of all the women murdered in the US, about 1/3 were killed by an intimate partner. And according to the National Survey for Injury Prevention and Control, women experience about 4.8 million partner related physical assaults and rapes every year. Less than 20% of the survivors sought medical treatment following an injury. And something to sort of take note as we go forward is that when we look at violence, differences between men and women, what we see is that for women, as you can see by the statistics that I'm sharing with you, a larger majority of violence against women is perpetrated by an intimate partner or somebody that they know, which is different for men, where a lot of times the violence that is being perpetrated are by individuals that they don't know or have an intimate relationship with. The reason that we focus on rape culture instead of just looking at sexual assault and sort of the incidence of sexual assault is that it's far too simple to just look at the perpetrators, because it's far too simple to look at something like, very well-known cases of repeated perpetrators of sexual violence, like, for example, a Harvey Weinstein or a Brock Turner or a Bill Cosby, um, or an R. Kelly, for example, where we see with money, power, and control, they've been able to perpetrate horrific long term violence against particularly women and so forth. Um, Yes, these cases are important and to look at it and to look at how institutions failed women, particularly survivors. At the same time, focusing just on them, it's too easy to then sort of separate them and be like, oh, well, these are the bad people, these are the bad perpetrators. And, therefore, they came out of nowhere. When in reality, sexual assault, rape, sexual violence is part of our culture. And we need to sort of talk about, like, what is the culture that we live in that allows for violence, particularly sexual violence against women, to occur. At the heart of it, what we're talking about is rape culture. And for those of you who have taken my previous classes in women's studies, we've talked a lot about rape culture, but I want to make sure that for those of you who haven't, that we have a good working definition and so forth. So we're just going to talk a little bit about rape culture, and then we're going to unpack it more in regards to sexual assault, both in regards to the history of addressing sexual assault legally in the United States to looking at it medically and so forth. What is rape culture? So, what exactly are we talking about here? Essentially, rape culture is the culture that we live in. We live in rape culture. And simply speaking, it's an environment where rape is present, in which sexual violence is normalized or even celebrated, particularly against women, but we can also talk about sexual violence against men, in which sexual violence is excused or again celebrated in the media or popular culture. And it's infiltrated in many ways. So it's not just like acts of sexual violence, but also the way that we address, talk, think, uh, perform as well in regards to sexual violence, particularly against women. So, rape culture is perpetrated through the use of many things, right? So, it's not just one act, whether that's misogynistic language, the objectification of women's bodies, and the glamorization of sexual violence. We can see this a lot in the media. And at the heart of it, what does rape culture do? The culture that we live in creates a society that disregards women's rights and safety. There are, of course, a lot of examples of rape culture because, again, rape culture is about how we collectively think about rape, sexual assault, sexual violence against women. So, for me, and I know I've shared these examples in previous courses that I've taught. I think about examples such as at the university that I did my PhD, they have an MBA program, very prestigious one. And what they used to do during, like, the first week of schools, where like you have all the freshmen coming in and it's a big celebration and you do a lot of events and parties and so forth, this was the chant that they would often do, which was, Y is for your sister, O is for oh so tight, U is for underage, N is for no consent, G is for grab that ass. Now, they would chant this at the freshman girls while they were entering the MBA program because, of course, this is something that is very important when you're getting a master's in business. It was reported, and finally, the MBA program got a lot of discipline around it. But the fact that this chant had been going on for like decades speaks to how nobody thought it was a big deal and almost accepted it. I'm sure the women who were attending didn't think it was a big deal, but because of rape culture and the way that we sort of treat, particularly people coming forward to address that they felt uncomfortable or that they were assaulted or so forth, this is how these circumstances can continue, where you can have a very disgusting chant at a freshman orientation last for decades and see it as a tradition instead of something that is highly offensive. Of course, the example that I gave before, pop music that tells you you know you want it because of these blurred lines. There are hundreds of examples of this. Blurred lines is not even the most egregious example. To things that are very serious, such as the constant dismissal of rape cases because of particularly just for women in regards to how they dress, their sexual history, if they flirted, if they are attractive. For example, a couple years ago, a woman's rape case was dismissed because she was wearing skinny jeans at the time of the assault, and the judge therefore said that skinny jeans are so hard to take off, there's no way she could have been assaulted. Really disgusting. Two things that we see very much still in the news, whether it's an athlete or a celebrity or a fraternity and so forth, of supporting, these individuals who are charged with rape and calling their victims career destroyers and so forth, to something that, for those of you who are interested in going into journalism, being really critical about the way that they talk about sexual assault. We're journalists who substitute the word sex for rape as if it means the same thing. To something that I think a lot of us have experienced, particularly for those who identify as female, of being a young person and being sexually harassed in the street. When I've asked students about, like, when were you first catcalled, it's shocking. 8 years old, 10 years old. Like, you're not even adult women and you're being already objectified. At the heart of rape culture is that it's nebulous, meaning that it is impacting every part. So it's not just, again, the act itself of sexual assault, rape, but actually the culture that creates it, where we not only see it permissible, but almost see it as a reward, right? Rapists don't come out of the bushes. Somebody is not born a rapist, right? We have a culture that not only encourages sexual violence, but also rewards it in many ways. So, it's not about isolated incidents, it's around the attitudes and actions that reinforce and excuse higher up. So, I really like this image because it's about how simple things that we don't even think about connected to sexual assault, like boys will be boys, unequal sexist attitudes, victim blaming, can lead to then explicit violence. And it's important. You cannot talk about the top of the pyramid without going further down to sort of show how it's all connected and that this is the culture that we create. And rape culture has very severe impacts, right? For example, again, so the statistics 1 in 4, you can also say 1 in 5. Again, the number of reporting is still a very big issue. But in this sort of media image, 1 in 5 American women have survived an attempt or completed rape, but survivors are doubted, shamed, and harassed. So, for example, and something that we're going to talk about more later in this lecture, about rape cases are not being reported. Only a third of all rapes are actually reported. A lot of that is because survivors are afraid to go forward. And if a survivor does report, police might not investigate. There are tens of thousands of rape kits sitting untested across the United States. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Prosecutors often refuse to take up cases that the police do recommend. Fewer than 4 in 10 cases are ever prosecuted, and a lot of times it's because they feel that it's unwinnable. And we're going to talk about more about why that is. If a rape case does go to trial, survivors are often re-traumatized by the process. Defense attorneys shame them, blame them. I mean, it's really, really, it's a very, very horrific ordeal that particularly survivors do have to go through to fight for their own rights. And a lot of that is because they are automatically assumed lying or guilty. So, because there's still this idea that people think rape survivors are making it all up, 6% or less of charges may be false, but students think up to 50% of rape reports are fabricated, and not just students, but just people in general. Like, the number of false reporting is the same number of false reporting in regards to robbery, yet we don't ever talk about that when somebody says, I was robbed. They're like, oh, were you really robbed? Yet when you're sexually assaulted, you're automatically sort of judged or not believed. And even if a rapist is convicted, he can receive, or they can receive, extraordinarily light sentences, with only 3% of rapists even spending a day in jail. We're going to talk about this more. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, we're focusing on particularly rape culture from a public health perspective. As this is a public health class, I think it's really important to sort of talk about a public health approach to sexual assault. So, how we're going to do this from here out is we're going to talk about the history of addressing sexual assault and rape in the United States. Um, Shocker there, it's not great. And then we're going to talk about particularly feminist interventions around rape and sexual assault. And then we'll get into talking about the nitty gritty of a public health approach to rape culture, sexual assault, rape, sexual violence against women. Okay, as I alluded to in the other slide, we have a really terrible history in regards to this. But let's just talk about it because it's important to understand the context as we go forward. So it's broadly speaking, but it's fair to say that in most cultures and religions, there are rules and punishments around kidnapping, abduction, forced marriage, sexual assault, and rape. And the reason why I'm putting all of those together is oftentimes, when we look at the historical record and sort of cultures, they're kind of seen all as the same bubble, meaning that a lot of times, sort of cultural rules, norms, history of treating sexual assault has less been about the act itself, but more about kidnapping the person, abducting them, forcing them into a marriage. And a lot of that is because in a large percentage of cultures, particularly if we look at Christianity, as well as other sort of faiths and religions and so forth, women have historically been treated as property. Now, of course, this is not the case in many other communities, particularly if we look at Native American communities and so forth, but just broadly speaking, again, painting a wide paintbrush, throughout time, women have been regarded mostly as property in many cultures and societies. And therefore, that is why, like, if you look at, like, for example, in many Christian countries, like medieval Europe and so forth, you see these sort of the same punishments around kidnapping, abduction, and forced marriage happening around whether or not sexual assault or rape have occurred, because it's about stealing a property. So, one of the things that the biggest obstacle around the recognition of rape as a crime um, has been that for much of recorded history, women have been seen or put into the property of men, with their value as property measured largely by their sexual purity, right? So in this context, rape have often been regarded as a property crime against a woman's husband or father, so not even against herself. So a biggest obstacle around sexual assault has been around recognizing it as a crime against the victim herself, because for a long time of history, it's just been a crime against the father or the husband. A raped woman or girl was less valuable as property, and therefore then, like, penalties for rapes often involve fines or other compensation paid to the husband or the father, not even to the girl. For example, in early American settler colonies, their rape was seen as, again, about a violation of a husband and father's property. And in fact, they they really sort of, like, had very loose ideas about when sexual violence could actually occur, because they believed that it was only against, sexual violence could only happen to a girl 10 years or younger, because she was innocent. After that, she's a woman, and therefore she knew what she was doing and asking for it and so forth. So a lot of times women would also be equally punished for their assault. And of course, as property, things such as marital rape, which is the act of sexual intercourse with one spouse without the spouse's consent, was not seen as existing. Essentially, that a husband could have sex or could forcibly have sex with his spouse and without her consent or and so forth, and it was seen as, well, that's his property. So, as I said before, sexual assault, while it was on the law, law books since the middle, since Roman times and so forth, a lot of it was more just sort of addressing and alleviating the husband or father's concerns, and not around actually advocating justice for the victim herself. And, you know, we still see a lot of these remnants. But when we look at historically, we still see that, the criminal justice system historically around sexual assault has been incredibly unfair. A lot of it is around sexist stereotypes and laws combined to make rape a criminal proceeding in which the victim and her behavior were tried rather than the defendant. So when a woman would come forward and say that she's been sexually assaulted, she could actually receive greater punishment. Not only could she severely damage her own social standings, courts tended to be skeptical of the charges, conviction rates were low, and in the event that accusations could not be proved, the victim could be accused of committing adultery with the rapist. So, adult women, for a long time in history, particularly history in the United States, were often extremely reluctant to bring up charges of rape out of fear of further punishment. And even after the right to vote, so the 19th Amendment that happened in the early 1900s, still women were very much afraid because they could still lose a lot of social standing, because there was still a lot of sexist stereotypes and laws combined that made it so that they were still punishable. Of course, it's really important that when we're talking about sexual violence through history, and yes, I'm painting a very broad picture here, and we could go into more detail in regards to different cultures and societies. When we talk about the United States, it's really important that when we talk about the history of sexual assault laws and treatments and so forth, that what I've been talking about in regards to women advocating for themselves in the courts is particularly very much the domain of very privileged white settler women, because historically this country has been based a lot around, as we've looked at previous readings, around sexual violence against indigenous women, women of color, immigrant women, as well as sex workers. For example, that, it since settler colonialism first started here in the United States, back when the first sort of colonists came here, it was perfectly acceptable as well as warranted to abduct and sexually violate American Indian women, seeing them as already sexually violable and therefore rapeable, and therefore seen as already impure, so it didn't matter. And unfortunately, these ideas and beliefs, particularly around American Indian women, have continued forward, so that we have epidemic proportions of violence in regards to American Indian women today. But we look at also then like the history of African American women, since the beginning of colonialism and slavery, any sort of rape laws that were on the books, which were limited at best, mostly, again, as I said before, serving husbands and fathers in regards to like their damaged property, which were women, did not apply to slaves, and did not apply. And then even after slavery ended, African American women still had the legacy of slavery on them, which resulted in incredible amounts of violence against sexual violence against Black women. Miscegenation laws, so these were laws around banning mixed race relationships, meant that for women of color, whether that was Asian American women, you could also talk about Chicana, Latinx women, you see that even if they went to the courts to fight against the perpetrator, they could also be tried for violating miscegenation laws, even if it was sexual assault. And of course, also, sex workers were legally not allowed to actually file a charge around rape. So if you were a sex worker, you had no legal sort of means to fight against your sexual assault. So, broadly speaking, when we talk about the history of sexual violence, whether through history or whether through just looking at the United States from colonial times till up until the 70s, it was pretty dire, where most of the laws were directed to, if there was any sort of justice, it was mostly directed for the husbands and the fathers. And then, even after, when women were technically no longer legally defined as property with the right to vote, with the 19th Amendment, it did not mean that then, that these sort of laws that were on the books actually serviced women. And many women, particularly women of color, had very limited access to no access to rights and to sort of advocate for themselves and to have justice. As I said in the previous slide, when we look at history, particularly the history of how the sexual assault has been legally defined in the United States, rape laws around rape have existed since colonial times. Now, again, as I said before, they mostly served not the victim, but the victim's husband or father, right? So, because again, women were regarded as property, therefore, it was not about justice for the victim, but justice for the property owner, so either father or husband. And then other forms of sexual assault were not even considered sexual assault, such as marital rape, right? Because again, if a woman is the property of her husband, therefore then is he can do whatever he wants to her. And then, considering the racist settler colonial history of the United States, many, particularly women of color, weren't even given sort of access to these laws or were pretty much rejected on the onset in regards to filing charges around sexual assault because they were either deemed that they're totally rapeable or seen as also perpetrating a crime, as well as just flat out denied being able to file a charge around rape. So while laws in the books were there, doesn't necessarily mean that it protected women. And even when women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment and technically became legal citizens, so therefore not property, it did not mean that a lot of things had changed, right? Because again, even for those who were very privileged, white women especially, going forward, making it a charge, trying to get some sort of legal justice around their sexual assault, meant a lot of times that they were shamed. They were, most of their cases were refused because they were seen as not credible. A lot of sort of laws were put into place that very much made it so that it was impossible to even make a charge around rape because it was so narrowly defined. So, all of that being said, is that, while there were laws on the books, it didn't necessarily mean that there was justice for women. And a lot of the conversations that we have today around sexual assault and the advocacy around it, we really owe to the second wave, who took up violence against women as a central part in their movement. And a lot of the sort of institutions that we have come from the second wave activism around this. First among these, the second wave movement did, so starting from the 60s to the 80s, was around changing the language around sexual assault. So first of all, it was around breaking the silence, right? Like, let's actually talk about it because it is present. It is not like it was happening less in the past than it is now. It was happening very much in the past, but there was incredible amounts of silence and stigma. There's still silence and stigma, but there was even more so back then. And you really owe it to the feminist movement for sort of breaking the silence. So one of the things that they did was, for example, do protests like Take Back the Night, which is something that we still celebrate here at Fresno State. Take Back the Night simply is a stand that says that women should be able to walk the street at night without being sexually assaulted, but even just having the fear of being sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, and we are still having marches around Take Back the Night because we still have a challenge. But again, Take Back the Night comes from the second wave movement of breaking the silence. as well as challenging myths around rape, because and it's still today that it's seen a lot of times as rare and exceptional, when in case when we look at the numbers prove us that it's not. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women have reported being sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and that it is a common experience in the lives of girls and women. And not only that sexual assault is a common experience, but the fear of it. So, whether or not a woman had experienced sexual assault herself, she knows others, as well as the constant, always fear from a very young age of being sexually assaulted. And that needs to be taken into it. That is not an acceptable way of living. And another thing that the feminist movement did, besides many other things around this, and again, this is just a broad um, sort of reflection about what the second wave did around sexual assault, they changed the conversation around removing desire from rape, because and it still is to today, where a lot of sort of ways that people have defended rapists has been that, well, they were sexually desirable or really attracted to that person, and they just couldn't control themselves. And what can you do? It's libido. She shouldn't have worn that dress. He shouldn't have flirted, etc. Right? And it's with feminists that have really sort of brought forward that, sexual assault, rape, sexual violence in its full spectrum, from sexual objectification to harassment to violence, is never about desire. It's never about that you find this person attractive. It's always about power and control, particularly power control over a woman's body. And we still have to fight, sort of change that narrative, because there's still a lot of, dismissal that, like, well, boys will be boys, or you can't help it if they are sexually attracted to you. And, sometimes people get into primal mode and they can't control themselves. And reality is like, yes, you can. It's about power and control, and about how how we as society have objectified women, made them into property to be powered, to be overpowered and controlled, and that we need to change that. A lot of the other services we've also benefited from the second wave, because again, creating new discussions around sexual assault also meant, like, we need to create new institutions, because there were none. There were no sort of, you can't go to the police because the police aren't going to help you. And most of the services weren't there for you. So that's where you have the first rape crisis centers, domestic violence centers, coming from the second wave movement as a way to build a new infrastructure, particularly for survivors of sexual assault. And again, changing the conversation when you're broadening and talking about sexual assault, bringing in things that at a long time had not considered to be sexual assault, like marital rape. And it's feminists who push lawmakers to make marital rape a crime. Marital rape first became a crime in the United States in the state of South Dakota in 1975, and then it took about, unfortunately, almost 20 years until North Carolina became the last state to outlaw marital rape. But that's a really important movement that happened through the second wave. Another thing, again, is about broadening and really sort of talking about rape. Again, dispelling myths around it. One of the myths that is still very present today is that, that rape occurs in the scenario of, like, the perpetrator waiting in the bushes to attack you. When in reality, when we look at the numbers, women, particularly women, know who the perpetrator was. Like, they were either connected to them romantically, were a friend, were a coworker, a neighbor, or something. It's oftentimes not the perpetrator in the bushes. So it was through the second wave movement that you got recognition of date and acquaintance rate and so forth. There's a lot of contributions that we can talk about in regards to how the feminist movement, feminist activists, legal scholars, lawyers, and so forth have contributed to not only addressing sexual violence against women, but also fighting legal institutions in order to better protect survivors of sexual assault and to seek justice for survivors of sexual assault. way too much to cover even in just this lecture, but I do want to touch upon a couple areas, particularly around consent, because that's sort of a focus of our readings for this week, and I think it's really important to talk about feminist contributions around this. So, feminists from the 1970s onward, so from the second wave till today, so over 50 years, have been really challenging legal definitions around rape. Now, it does vary from state to state, but broadly speaking, rape has been legally defined on two grounds. One being force and the other being consent, meaning that the perpetrator had to force themselves onto the survivor, right? And force can be a range of things, but force has to be in there. And that the survivor or the victim did not give consent. Now, already when you can hear this, and I'm describing these two grounds, there's a lot of discretion, right? One, what is force? Is it have to be that the person held you down, or can it be that this person threatened your job or your family's livelihood, or threatened to deport you? Like, couldn't that be also force? To to things around like, for example, consent. What is consent? For still there's this idea that consent can only be that you firmly stated like no and repeatedly said no. But in reality, as we sort of have learned through doing research with survivors of sexual assault, a lot of times there is no sort of no or yes. And in fact, while they never gave consent, they never also said verbally no. So even on these two grounds, there's a lot of discrepancy. And feminists, particularly feminist activists and lawyers and so forth, have really sort of challenged um, the way the legal system has defined rape, as well as the biases within that. One way has been around removing rape shield laws. So think of rape shield laws as an umbrella term because it really sort of refers to laws that were very much used to protect the perpetrator and to essentially throw out rape cases. So, a rape shield law, a previous laws have been, for example, uh, when a victim came forward and went to court, their whole sexual history would be reviewed, meaning that that not the perpetrator's sexual history, but the victim's sexual history. And oftentimes, then that was used as a way to dismiss the victim's case, being like, well, they were sexually active with all these people, and therefore, what did they expect, etc. Right? Again, it was a way to remove that person's credibility. So, one way of removing this type of what we would consider a rape shield law is to make sure that courts no longer can review a victim's sexual history as evidence in the case. Another rape shield law was around prompt reporting. For a long time, there were very limited reporting times, meaning that if a victim came forward, it had to be within whether within 6 months to a year, and if anything was beyond that, if they didn't come forward with the assault before that and came after that, their case would be dismissed. And nowadays, luckily, due to the work of feminist activists and lawmakers, they have now, most states have removed that time reporting restriction or have broadened the time restriction from 1 year to 10 years to having no restriction. Because as we have known through research, that it can take up to decades for a survivor to finally come forward to seek justice because of the shame, stigma, and the sort of process that they're going to have to go through in regards to fighting for justice. Another rape shield law that was successfully removed was around this idea of corroboration, meaning that if a victim came forward, they also had to have somebody or some sort of evidence to corroborate their assault. So an eyewitness account, basically, like if somebody else did not see what had happened, then their case could be dismissed. So that was also removed because, again, that means that a large majority of cases would have never gone to court because, that's a very rare circumstances that somebody else is witnessing a sexual assault. And the idea that oftentimes judges and the prosecution or the defense would also make is the traditionary cautionary rule that rape is a charge easy to make, hard to disprove. And that was also removed. So, removing of these, what we could collectively consider rape shield laws, was a big step forward in fighting for victims' advocacy and rights for justice. Yet, even with these rape shield laws removed, and even with the over 50 years of work the feminist movement has been on getting, broadening the definitions around rape, talking about rape more openly, talking just about sexual violence against women more openly, there's still a lot of work to go, and especially around consent, because consent, as with the Ornstein chapter that you're going to be reading for this week, has, consent should be considered a low bar, and that the way that we have conceptualized consent is very limited. So feminist scholars have really argued around discussing around consent being limited in a patriarchal culture because, as feminists point out, that in most cases men have greater social and in most cases physical power than women. And therefore, and women's belief, living in this patriarchal world, surviving in this patriarchal world, women's beliefs, reactions are shaped by the constant threat of male violence in which women must have to live. And therefore, because of these differences, because we live in a hierarchical world, where men, yes, they can have much more authority and power over giving consent versus women who have to navigate a world where not only are their voices not counted or dismissed, but have to constantly navigate always the threat of male violence. This idea that we should have consent be seen equally, that either you act out consent in a way of like no, affirmatively, um, as men might, so again, basically putting a male model on consent is probably not only unfair but also impossible in a patriarchal world. So for women, so for feminists, they've sort of talked about, instead of talking about consent from a male perspective, that like men have the power and authority to say no and they face very little repercussions, whereas women, when women say no, there's much more repercussions. So then you're socially socially sort of trained to be always, in some ways, accommodating. We should talk about consent from a much broader perspective, and sort of that's where the conversation has moved from no meaning no to yes meaning yes, and not only yes meaning yes, but an enthusiastic yes. So it's not just a shrug or a nod, but in fact, that a woman is not only happiness and willing, but a sort of what McKinnon would call a welcomeness. That we should talk about consent less on like a yes no basis, but more on how welcomed the physical, intimate interactions are. Being that she observes that, whereas in when we live in a gender hierarchy where there's still a lot of social expectations that men should initiate any sort of sexual contact, and instead of thinking that women should either then accept and refuse, instead think of it as a welcomeness standard, where the centrality of the choice is either mutually and respected and desired. So more and less more about yes and no, and more about like, do I welcome this? Do I want this? And so forth. So challenging consent in a patriarchal world is really at the heart of what feminist movement has been really focusing on. And the Ornstein chapter is really going to talk a lot about this in much more broader perspectives. Of course, and something that we've talked about and just in the previous slides, that particularly feminists of color, indigenous feminists, as well as LGBTQ scholars have talked about is around sexual assault and its connection to settler colonialism, and which is what one of your readings is going to focus on around rape culture and colonialism. And I think it's important, again, as something why we had this class where we talked about settler colonialism in the beginning is because we need to always remind ourselves that all these conversations are being put into a certain stage, and particularly the stage around settler colonialism that creates not only a racial hierarchy, but a gendered hierarchy, a sexual hierarchy, and so forth. So it makes no surprise then when we look at the statistics around violence against women, we see epidemic proportions of particularly American Indian women, women of color, African American women, experiencing sexual violence at much greater numbers than their white counterparts. And a lot of that is a historical connection to ongoing violence against women of color and indigenous women. You can't sort of see this as not a continuum of violence. And that's really important, is to always draw those connections back to history as a way to just, one, not separate it as something that is like a new occurrence, because it is not a new occurrence, and we need to address the real foundations of where this violence comes forth. Obviously, from this quick overview of the history of sexual assault in the United States, at least legally speaking, to, the contributions of the feminist movement, there's a lot more work to be done. And if anything, this broad trek through history has shown is that legal definitions of rape and consent still matter, and they're still very much debated. What does consent really mean in a patriarchal world? What does examples of force really actually mean in a patriarchal world where women are taught and very much disciplined to be submissive, right? So these are still battlegrounds, and there's incredible amounts of legal loopholes still across the United States in regards to rape and sexual assault. For example, in Minnesota, there was still a loophole where a man cannot be prosecuted for raping his wife if she is drunk or asleep, right? Like, these loopholes are still very much there. And while, California law does define consent as a positive cooperation in the act of the exercise of free will, meaning that everyone engaging in sex has to indicate positive cooperation, meaning sort of taking on that welcomeness, that we're all welcoming this interaction. There's still incredible amounts of bias and discrepancy, right? Where, what does it mean to be a friend, welcomeness, and there's still incredible amounts of sex stereotyping, gender stereotyping, where oftentimes the victim is still very much blamed for the assault. So there's still incredible amounts of discrepancy and bias around consent, around force, around sexual assault, and so forth. There's also just institutional failure. Police oftentimes only tend to pursue cases involving sexual assault where they really actually feel like the victim was a righteous victim, i.e., the victim was raped by a stranger, the victim had fought back, the victim has a clean record, the victim is not a sex worker, the victim wasn't taking drugs. That is considered real rape. But, as we know, that is a very limited definition of rape. Yet there's still incredible amounts of failure by our police department to actually address and to fully pursue cases. And in fact, there's actually a backlog in regards to rape kits, where these are kits that are taken when the victim goes to the hospital, they get DNA testing and so forth. They're sent to the police department to get further investigated, and they just sit there because the police either don't want to bother with them, or they feel like that the victim was not a true victim in the sexual assault. And then even with that, so even if you do have a police that does actually pursue the case, prosecutors oftentimes don't take up these cases. Prosecutors are actually very much avoid cases in regards to sexual assault because they find them too difficult and unwinnable. Fewer than 4 in 10 cases are prosecuted. And a lot of that is because of the way that, of the sort of bias and discrimination in regards to how victims are treated. Getting a conviction for a rape is still very much a long shot, and as well as a nightmare, particularly for the survivor. When the survivor alleges rape, the defense and the jury dissects not only her character and history, but also her behavior and during and after the assault, um, where they then are, they then like judge their movements of, if like, did the perpetrator overpower the victim, did the victim then fight back, why did the victim then go meet the person the next day, all of these sort of discriminations and biases that should have been removed with, like, when you remove those rape shield laws, still come into play with jury's decisions, with judges' decisions. And while technically a victim should not be judged on their actions before or after the assault, they still very much are. So, what this has shown us is that there's a lot of institutional failure. When we look at legal systems, criminal justice systems, we see a lot of failure in regards to seeking justice for sexual assault, as well as preventing sexual assault, since the criminal justice system is very much more around prosecuting incidences and less about preventing. And even still, with prosecuting and finding justice for survivors, we have failed in many ways. Whereas, as I said previously, around the police failing to further cases or to pursue cases, we have an epidemic around the backlog of rape kit tests, particularly here in California. We have a very high number of police departments that have hundreds upon thousands of untested rape kits. In Fresno, we have a really significant problem. Between 2000 and 2016, hundreds of women have went to Fresno Hospital for being sexually assaulted and went to the hospital to have the sexual assault forensic exam. Many had just been raped, but they chose to have their bodies scraped and prodded for physical evidence to assist law enforcement in finding their attacker. And until the last few months, it was over 700. It's gone to 561, but that means that there's still 561 untested rape kits from like decades back, like 10 years or more back, sitting at the Fresno Police Department freezer with police officers not pursuing these cases. And a lot of times, the reason why is because the victims were women of color, immigrant women, undocumented women, homeless women, as well as sex workers. Of course, I know that we've been focusing mostly on legal aspects in the criminal justice system. We can talk about also sexual violence and prevention and so forth in regards to education, which is something that we have been addressing in regards to sex education and the fact that we don't really have a really good policies in place or practices in place in regards to having discussions around consent and around healthy sexual relationships. There's also, of course, an epidemic. What we see is that when we have limited to lack of sex education in high schools, we then see a connection between sexual assault in colleges, because you have a lot of then, as the reading for this week has shown, that you have a lot of college students then coming to campus with limited to no knowledge around consent and how it actually works. All of this is saying that there's a lot of institutions involved in regards to talking about sexual violence, right? Whether it's the criminal justice system, whether that is education. And now I want to talk about sexual violence and addressing sexual violence, but from a public health perspective, which I think provides a very interesting perspective on this, and something that I think can also provide a new sort of discussion around how to particularly prevent sexual assault from occurring in the first place. Now, this is technically a public health class, And for those of you who are public health majors, this is all a review for you, but I did want to talk a little bit about public health, which we've talked about, but I just want to make sure that we are on the same definition. So, public health, broadly speaking, is around providing the maximum benefit for the largest number of people, right? The goals of public health are inseparable from the goals of social justice, really, to create a world where the conditions around us allow everyone to thrive, where there is equality between groups, where inclusion creates the networks and bonds that nurture well being, and so forth. So, a big thing about public health is that it emphasizes prevention rather than treatment. So, doctors treat sick people. Public health is about preventing people from being sick in the first place. And with that, then, prevention is about emphasizing wellness and promoting healthy changes and so forth. A big important factor around public health is around its 4 distinct steps, which is pretty much adopted throughout any sort of public health research, programs, policies, and so forth. And I want to talk about these steps in regards to how public health has been applied to sexual violence. So these 4 distinct steps are: define the scope of the problem, determine the cause of the problem, determine effective interventions, and implement these interventions. So pretty straightforward. And these then are used throughout any sort of health issue. Another thing that public health offers is that it stresses a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just one sort of intervention, right? It's using multiple different types of intervention. For a long time, sexual violence was not seen as being part of the domain of public health. For the most part, sexual violence was seen as the domain of criminal justice and legal, right? As what we talked about before, where most sort of discussions around addressing sexual violence had been around what the criminal justice system can do and what can legal scholars and definitions can do to stop sexual assault. And public health, for the most part, kind of didn't really address it. It doesn't mean to say that there wasn't discussions around sexual violence, but for the most part, public health had not really addressed it. But within the past 20 years, thanks to a lot of feminist scholars within public health, we have seen a switch where sexual violence is now very much seen as a domain of public health and something that public health is very much focused on in regards to preventing. And a big part of that has been around changing the sort of discussion around sexual violence as not being just about the perpetrators or the offenders, but seeing it as an epidemic. And these statistics, which I've shared before, kind of help you frame it as an epidemic. If 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault, already you have a high number of population that is experiencing this sort of form of violence. 2, when you sort of look at the numbers, also you see that it also affects very marginalized populations within a population. So women of color disproportionately experience sexual violence. LGBT persons, particularly trans women of color, experience high rates of sexual violence. People with disabilities have experience higher rates of sexual violence than people without disabilities, right? So here you have a population that not only experiences sexual violence at pretty high rates, but then those who are marginalized within that population experience them even at a greater rate. So what you can then say is that it's not just an issue of offenders or perpetrators, but an issue in regards that is affecting a large population. So public health has advocated that, yes, prosecution and incarceration of offenders is important. Again, it's not about throwing out the criminal justice model around treating sexual assault and addressing sexual assault. Perpetrators should go to jail. And there's still a huge battleground in regards to getting full justice in the courts for survivors. But while prosecution and incarceration of offenders may provide a sense of relief as well as justice and maybe even some deterrence, that's not enough. And if it was enough, then we would have far less sexual assault today, right? Because the laws have gotten better, right? even though we have a long way to go, more and more people who have perpetrated acts of sexual violence are like going to jail or getting at least prosecuted. Doesn't mean though that the more and more people that are getting prosecuted for these cases doesn't mean that sexual assault has actually dipped. In fact, is we don't really see that much of a deterrence. So while the criminal justice system is very important, particularly in regards to justice for survivors, when we talk about sexual assault as an epidemic, something that's affecting a huge population, the majority of us, then we need to really talk about prevention rather than just prosecution. So, from a public health perspective, we need to prevent sexual assault and sexual abuse from occurring in the first place. So, again, all about prevention. And to not content ourselves with reacting after somebody has violated and harmed. Like, already then, from a public health perspective, it's too late. We needed to be, in some ways, way before that incident had occurred. And so, therefore, then, what public health advocates have said that the public health system should be there to alleviate, not perpetrate, the terror and the humiliation that sexual assault survivors have to experience, and instead find ways to not only alleviate but to prevent. So, applying the sort of principles of public health to sexual violence, we see this. The first step is in any sort of public health approach is around surveillance, which is defined as sort of the ongoing systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of health data. Basically, we need to find out how many people are being sexually assaulted, what's happening, how is it occurring, and so forth. It's essentially getting the data. So one is about defining the problem through collection, right? And understanding there then the characteristics, consequences, and scopes of this violence. The second approach that you need to take within a public health system in regards to sexual violence is around risk factors. So that's around focusing on which factors place an individual at higher risk for an unhealthy consequence, such as sexual violence perpetration or victimization. So, to establish essentially why violence occurs, using research to determine the causes and correlates of violence, the factors that increase or decrease the risk of violence, and the factors that could be modified through interventions. So, for example, a great illustration of this is like if you were looking up smoking as a risk factor for lung cancer, for example. This is from a public health perspective. What you would do is you would look at how, while smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer, not all smokers will eventually develop lung cancer. However, persons who smoke are more likely than non-smokers to develop this disease. So when we look at sexual assault or sexual violence, we want to look at the risk factor for sexual violence, meaning that, like, for example, a risk factor for sexual violence for perpetrators does not mean that all persons exposed to this factor will develop into sexual offenders. Rather, that the development of, let's say, sexually aggressive behaviors, a culture that also supports that, institutions that support that, is statistically more likely to have that person become a sexual offender because of being exposed to that, right? For example, many other sort of examples, but really sort of looking at like why does this violence occur and what are the factors that lead to this violence occurring. And then the third step in any sort of public health model is the development and evaluation of programs. So though there are many sexual violence prevention programs, most have not actually undergone rigorous evaluation efforts. So that means then from a public health perspective, we need to have a much stronger evaluation of like, are these sort of prevention programs actually effective? So we need to look at the likelihood of having effective prevention programs in place is increased if development of such programs is based on the knowledge of the risk factors, and to identify also again the research that has been already presented. So essentially to find out what works to prevent violence by designing, implementing, and evaluating interventions that have already been put into place, but maybe even creating new ones that are more effective. And then once you've done that, and that's going to take many processes and trials and errors, it's about then disseminating what works. So the final step of any sort of public health intervention is to disseminate of information on what works. And it's important to share widely information on what works, and this can be done in a multitude of ways. But it's about, again, once you've evaluated and found a program that actually prevents, it's about then getting it to the masses as fast as possible. So a good example or a way of talking about how the public health perspective or public health model can be effective is when we talk about sexual assault in the military, which there is high levels of sexual assault, particularly sexual assault of female service members in the military. For example, it's on average that 6.2% of women in service and 0.7% of men in service have experienced a sexual assault in the past 12 months. Like that is the number, right? So here we have an epidemic within the military around sexual assault that particularly affects women, but men are also victims as well. So part of it then, if we were taking it from a public health perspective, is we need to get reporting on these numbers, what is happening. So part of it is first surveillance. One is figuring out not only who is being sexually assaulted, how are they reporting, but also the sort of factors that cause sexual assault to occur. And that's been a big challenge within the military, where there's incredible high numbers of underreporting. And even though there have been effective interventions to try to make it easier for service members to report, that doesn't necessarily mean that people have been reporting more. So a big part of public health research on this has been around better reporting, better data on this. Another thing is then looking at risk factors. So this is just an example of a public health research that has just been published around looking at, looking at risk factors and looking at how unit support, or basically unit relationships around the sort of the cohesiveness of the group, the way that the group treats each other, the way that the unit treats each other, creates a risk factor in regards to lessening or widening sexual assault. So when the unit is much more when the relationship with the service members is much less, or is much more fractious or much more damaging or contentious or whatever with their unit, actually you see a higher level or higher number of sexual assault or sexual harassments and so forth during deployment. So one of what this article is arguing is that if you have a much more cohesive unit, one that emphasizes mutual respect and so forth, that sexual assault will not occur as high, or sexual harassment won't occur as high. So that is a great way of looking at a risk factor around just unit cohesion that can lead to greater numbers of sexual assault or not, or to reduce it. And then, from there, then you can look at ways to then implement policies and programs that can do it. So just recently, last year, there was a preventative plan of action by the Department of Defense, which is all around a public health model of preventing. So it's not about just getting offenders, which is still a very important thing to do, but around preventing it from occurring in the first place. Yet, I think it's also important to state that the work is never done. And while there have been effective public health interventions around sexual assault in the military, we actually see a surge right now. Sexual assault in the American military has surged, particularly in the last 2 years, driven almost entirely by a 50% increase in the assaults of women in uniform. Uh, and there's still now questions about what is going on, because women now make up about 20% of the military, but our target's around 63% of assaults. And while the military did take disciplinary action of some kind in 65% of the cases, there's still, a lot of commanders are not doing their due diligence in supporting survivors and protecting them, and also um, uh, doing any sort of disciplinary action to the offenders. So there's still a lot of work to go, and it's an interesting thing right now in public health around sexual assault within the military, because they are trying to figure out what are ways to prevent it, and it's always changing. So it'll be interesting to see. But that's just one example of using a public health model. I'm not saying that it's going to be the be all end all solution, but I am saying that it provides different conversations around sexual assault that switches the focus from offenders to prevention, which is also very much needed. There's been a lot of intervention by public health within in regards to sexual assault on college campuses, and actually you can see a lot of public health research focusing directly on sexual assault on campuses, looking at ways to not only survey, so figuring out what's going on, looking at the risk factors like such as alcohol, community relationships, ideas around consent, and so forth, but then also effective try-to inventions to prevent and solutions. And, a lot of the services that we see today on campus that are there to not only support survivors but to also try to prevent have come from public health research. So whether that is the confidential advocacy service that is here at Fresno, that provides, advocacy and support for survivors, to Title IX, which has been expanded to looking at that Title IX is all about sex discrimination, and that part of it is that you can also then file a Title IX complaint against somebody who has either harassed you, assaulted you, and so forth, to gender programs and services and so forth. One of the things that the public health model has been around education. So all of you have had to take Not Anymore. And while we can talk about how effective that is, especially since you can just Google those answers very easily, and it's something that I think is fair to critique, we can talk about how much prevention is there. And while, again, public health is a really important model for regarding sexual assault, there's still much more work to be done. This is just a picture of last year's Take Back the Night. And if anything, it speaks to the fact that we are still very much fighting the battles that we have fought for the past 70 years in regards to fighting for survivors. And under the coronavirus now, there's a lot of issues. Not only has there been a spike in domestic violence and sexual assault, particularly under the shelter-in-place mandate, but when we talk about sexual assault on college campuses, the coronavirus has left many sexual assault survivors in limbo because of the coronavirus, because of campuses being kind of shut down or not shut down. So for all of us, as we continue forward, if anything of this lecture, what we can see is a long arc in history of fighting, and that in many ways we're fighting the same battles in regards to fighting for survivors, fighting against rape culture, and creating a new future where rape does not have to be the norm or to be expected. And yes, there are many different ways that we can intervene in this in regards to the criminal justice system, in regards to education, and in regards to public health. But I think, I'm always, while it can be feeling a little bit discouraging that there's still so many battles to be fought and one step forward seems like two steps back, but within our battles there is still progress, and it's important to sort of take that forward. All right, everyone. I'll see you in discussion.